The moment I stepped off the plane in Atlanta, I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years, the particular weight of American air in August, thick and warm, pressing against you like an old friend you weren't sure still recognized you. I had a single carry-on bag, a phone with a cracked screen, and a surprise from my son that I'd been planning since Christmas. I never told him I was coming. I wanted to see his face when he opened the door. I should have called first. The cab driver tried to make conversation on the 40-minute ride from Hartsfield-Jackson to the house I'd built in Marietta before my wife passed. I gave one-word answers. I was too busy watching the familiar exits roll by, counting the landmarks I'd memorized in my mind during 8 years of working pipeline construction in Alberta, Canada. The water tower with the faded peach painted on the side. The church with the broken marquee sign that still said "God is good" even though half the letters had fallen off years ago. The gas station on the corner of Powder Springs Road where my son used to buy baseball cards as a kid. I paid the driver, grabbed my bag, and stood on the sidewalk in front of the house. Something felt wrong before I could name it. The lawn was immaculate, too immaculate, the kind that comes from a professional service, not from a young man who'd never much cared about yard work. There was a different car in the driveway, a large black SUV with a dealer sticker still on the back. And in the front window, I could see curtains I didn't recognize. Heavy, dark burgundy curtains where my wife's white lace ones used to hang. I stood there for a long moment. Then I walked to the front door and knocked. A woman answered. She was in her mid-30s, wearing what I can only describe as expensive casual silk blouse, gold bracelet, manicured nails. She looked at me the way you look at a delivery person who's come to the wrong address. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for my son," I said. "This is his house. My house, actually. I built it." Something shifted behind her eyes. Just a flicker. She smiled the kind of smile that doesn't involve the upper half of the face. "Oh," she said. "You must be Richard's father." "That's right," I said. "Where is he?" She paused just a half-second too long. "He's out back," she said. "I'll let him know you're here." And she started to close the door. I put my hand on the frame. Gently, but firmly. "I'll find him myself," I said. "Thank you." I walked around the side of the house before she could argue. The gate to the backyard was latched but not locked. I opened it and stepped through. What I saw on the other side of that gate is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My son was standing at a workbench along the back fence, the one I'd built from pressure-treated lumber the summer he turned 16. He was wearing clothes that were too thin for yard work, a faded t-shirt, jeans with a tear at the knee. He was sanding something, head down, back bent in the posture of a man who has gotten used to making himself small. There were grease stains on his forearms, and what looked like a bruise, yellowish green and healing, along his left jawline. He didn't hear me come in. I stood there for 3 seconds, just 3, watching my son in the backyard of the house where he grew up, looking like a stranger, and I felt something crack open inside my chest that I don't have a word for in any language. "Son," I said. He spun around so fast he knocked the sandpaper off the bench. When he saw me, his face went through about 6 emotions in the space of 2 seconds. Shock, confusion, something desperate and raw. And then he looked back toward the house, involuntarily, the way you look at something you're afraid of. "Dad," he said. His voice was low. "What are you? You didn't tell me you were coming." "I wanted to surprise you." I crossed the yard and pulled him into a hug. He was thinner than I remembered. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. "Too fast." I stepped back and looked at him. Really looked at him. The bruise on his jaw. The way he kept glancing at the back door of the house. The hollowness around his eyes that wasn't just tired, it was the look of someone who hasn't felt safe in a very long time. "You're not fine," I said quietly. "Dad, that bruise. Who did that?" He looked away. "I fell," he said. I had a lot of questions that afternoon. I got very few answers. My daughter-in-law and her mother, who I hadn't known was living there, and her younger brother, who was sleeping in what used to be my son's home office. They all appeared in the backyard within 10 minutes, orbiting my son like satellites, making sure no conversation went anywhere they didn't sanction. My daughter-in-law's mother was a compact, sharp-faced woman who introduced herself without being asked, and immediately began telling me how much they'd done to update the house. I was shown a new kitchen, new flooring in the living room, a bathroom renovation I didn't authorize and hadn't been consulted about. Photos of people I didn't know hung on walls where my late wife's watercolors used to be. I didn't see a single photograph of my son from before his marriage. Not one. "Where do you sleep?" I asked my son, during a moment when the three of them had gone into the kitchen. He hesitated. "The basement," he said. "We converted it. It's nice now." "You're sleeping in the basement of your own house." "It's our house," he said, quietly, mechanically, like he'd been told to say it enough times that it had replaced something else. I left that evening and checked into a Holiday Inn 4 miles away. I sat on the edge of the bed with my shoes still on, and I called my oldest friend, a man I've known since we were 11 years old, who retired from law 3 years ago. I told him what I'd seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, tell me everything about that house. Title, deed, everything. Start from the beginning." I started from the beginning. The house on Clover Ridge Drive was built in 1987. I built most of it myself, with 2 hired contractors and a lot of weekends. My wife picked the paint colors and argued with me about the placement of every single window, and she was right about all of it. We raised our son in that house. When she passed 6 years ago, the house went to me. When I took the Canada contract 2 years later, I sat my son down at the kitchen table and I told him, "This house is yours to live in while I'm gone. I'll put your name on it as co-owner, so there are no complications if anything happens to me." He was 29. He'd been with my daughter-in-law for about a year at that point. I had no reason to think that was a mistake. I added his name to the deed. I did not remove mine. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters enormously for what came later. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, because my son did not tell me and I had not been perceptive enough to notice the signs in our phone calls, was that within 14 months of my departure, things in that house had changed so completely that it barely resembled the life I'd left behind. The calls had gotten shorter. I'd noticed that. Excuses about being busy, bad connection, work schedule. I'd chalked it up to him settling into married life. I told myself I was being one of those overbearing fathers. I gave him space. I sent money every month, not because he needed it financially. He had a decent job as an HVAC technician, but because I liked being useful from a distance. I found out later that the money I sent went into a joint account that my daughter-in-law managed, and that my son had not had independent access to a credit card in over 2 years. Over the course of the next 4 days, staying in that Holiday Inn, I started to understand what had happened to my son in my absence. I want to explain something first. My son is not a weak man. He is quiet, and he is gentle, and he inherited his mother's way of absorbing other people's pain before his own. That is not weakness, but it is a quality that certain kinds of people learn to exploit. And what I came to understand, piece by piece, through careful conversations in parking lots and through documents I requested from Cobb County's Public Records Office, and through a 2-hour meeting with a family law attorney named Patricia Osei, who came highly recommended and charged accordingly, what I came to understand is that isolation is a slow process. You don't notice it while it's happening. One friend stops calling because visits to the house became uncomfortable. One hobby disappears because there's always something more pressing. One phone call to your father gets cut short because dinner is ready, or someone needs something, or the timing is never quite right. And then one day you look up and the world has shrunk to the size of the basement room you've been sleeping in, and you can't quite remember how it got so small. My daughter-in-law's family had moved in gradually, each member arriving with a reason that seemed temporary. Her mother came for a few weeks to help after my daughter-in-law had a minor medical procedure. That was 3 years ago. Her brother arrived after losing his apartment just until he got back on his feet. That was 2 years ago. The home office became his bedroom. The master bedroom, the room where my wife spent the last years of her life, where I had slept every night for 29 years, became my daughter-in-law's domain, redecorated completely within 6 months of my departure in a way that erased my wife as thoroughly as paint and throw pillows could manage. My son moved to the basement. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was fine. The attorney, Patricia, leaned across her desk on the second day and looked at me steadily. "Mr. Walter," she said, "I need to ask you some questions about the deed, and I need you to be very precise." I was precise. She pulled up the Cobb County property records on her laptop, turned it toward me, and pointed at something on the screen. "Do you know what this is?" I looked. It was a quitclaim deed, dated 14 months ago, with my son's signature on it. According to that document, my son had signed over his ownership interest in the property to my daughter-in-law as sole owner. My name was still on the deed. They hadn't been able to remove me without my signature, but my son's half had been transferred. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means, Patricia said, that if you were to pass away, your half would go through your estate, and if your son's name isn't in your will as beneficiary, the house could go through probate in ways that would benefit his wife more than him. It also means he currently has no legal ownership claim to the property he's living in. I sat with that for a moment. Would he have understood what he was signing? Patricia looked at me carefully. That, she said, is the right question to ask, and the answer depends very much on the circumstances under which that signature was obtained. I spent the next 2 days finding out the circumstances. My son, as I said, is not a man who opens easily, but there is a particular kind of conversation that can only happen between a father and a son in a car, driving nowhere specific, when the son knows the father already knows something is wrong. I picked him up at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday, before anyone else in the house was awake. I told him I wanted to get breakfast. We drove to a diner in Kennesaw, sat in a corner booth, and I ordered coffee for both of us and waited. He talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about the quitclaim deed. He told me he'd signed it during a period when things between him and my daughter-in-law had been particularly bad. A series of arguments I won't detail, but that had left him feeling like the problem. Like everything wrong in the house was his fault. Like the reasonable thing, the loving thing, the thing that would fix everything, was to show her she could trust him, her idea, her attorney. Signed in her attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon. He told me her brother had been in 2 altercations at the house in the past year. He told me about a night 5 months ago when an argument had escalated and he'd ended up with that bruise on his jaw, which was not from falling. He told me he hadn't called me about any of it because he was ashamed, because he couldn't figure out how to explain it in a way that didn't make him sound like something had gone wrong with him fundamentally. Because every time he thought about calling me, a voice in his head that he recognized now, with some distance, as not entirely his own voice, told him I wouldn't understand. I'd be disappointed. It would only make things worse. I did not say anything for a long time after he finished. I watched a waitress refill the coffee cups at the table next to ours. I looked out the window at the parking lot. Then I said, "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Not one thing. Do you understand me?" He looked at the table. "Look at me," I said. "Do you understand me?" He looked up. His eyes were wet. He nodded. "Good," I said. "Now I need you to trust me, and I need you to let me handle some things. Can you do that?" He nodded again. I paid for the coffee and we drove back toward Marietta, and I started making phone calls. Patricia worked quickly once I gave her authorization to act. The fact that my name remained on the deed was significant. It meant any decisions about the property required my consent, and no one had gotten my consent for anything. She filed a motion to have the quitclaim deed reviewed on the grounds of undue influence and coercion, and she contacted a colleague who specialized in domestic situations to assess the circumstances under which the document had been signed. Simultaneously, I retained a separate attorney to address what had happened to my son in that house, specifically the physical incident 5 months prior. My son, initially reluctant, agreed to provide a statement. He also, at Patricia's advice, we visited a doctor for a full examination, the results of which documented not only the healed jaw injury, but evidence consistent with what the doctor carefully described in her report as a pattern of stress-related physical symptoms over an extended period. My daughter-in-law's attorney sent a letter within 48 hours of Patricia's filing. It was aggressive in tone and made claims about my son's instability and my interference in a private marital matter. Patricia read it, set it down on her desk, and said good in a tone that confused me until she explained that aggressive early correspondence usually means the other party knows their position is weaker than they're presenting. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, I stayed in Marietta. I extended my contract leave. I had 4 weeks of unused paid time off accumulated, and my site supervisor, a good man named Greg, who I'd worked alongside for 5 years, told me to take whatever I needed. I checked out of the Holiday Inn and rented a furnished apartment 8 minutes from the house. My son began spending evenings there. At first an hour, then 2, then he'd stay for dinner, and we'd watch baseball and talk in the easy way we used to talk when he was in high school, before his mother got sick, before everything got complicated and heavy. He started to look better. Not all at once, it was slow, like watching something come back to life after a hard winter. He started smiling at jokes again. He started talking about his work, his clients, a customer whose old unit he'd nursed along for 3 seasons and finally convinced to replace last fall. Small things, but I noticed every one of them. One evening, about 3 weeks in, he asked me something that I'd been waiting for without knowing it. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you ever just, I don't know, push more when I stopped calling as much?" I had thought about my answer to this question before he asked it. "Because I was trying not to be the father who doesn't let his son have his own life," I said. I overcorrected. I told myself you were an adult and I needed to respect your privacy. And I used that as an excuse not to look too closely at things that were making me uneasy. He was quiet. "I should have pushed," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I should have called." "You were being prevented from calling," I said. "That's different." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "Yeah, just that." The hearing was on a Thursday morning in October, and the room was smaller than I expected, a conference room attached to a family court judge's chambers rather than a full courtroom. My daughter-in-law came with her attorney and her mother, who had not been invited but arrived anyway. My son sat next to his own attorney, a young man Patricia had recommended named Darius, who was quieter than I expected and more effective than I anticipated. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the patient, unhurried manner of someone who has heard a great many things and cannot be easily shocked. She read through the filings with care. She asked my son 3 questions directly, without the attorney's mediating, in a tone that I can only describe as professionally kind. The key question, the one that mattered most, was about the circumstances of the signing. My son told the truth. He told it simply, without embellishment, the way I'd watched him practice telling it in my apartment kitchen while I made grilled cheese sandwiches, and he sat at the counter and talked through it out loud until the words stopped catching in his throat. The judge listened. She made a note. She asked my daughter-in-law's attorney 2 pointed questions about the timeline of the signing and the nature of the legal advice my son had received prior to it. The answer to the latter being that he had not received any, having been brought to an attorney who represented his wife's interests and presented with documents on the same day. She recessed for 20 minutes. When she came back, she voided the quitclaim deed. My son remained a co-owner of the house. My daughter-in-law was given 60 days to vacate along with any members of her household. The incident from 5 months prior was referred to the district attorney's office. And while I won't detail what followed beyond the legal process, I will say that the outcome was appropriate to the conduct involved. My daughter-in-law's mother and brother were gone within a week. They had somewhere else to go, it turned out, which suggested the temporary nature of their stays had been a different kind of temporary than they'd presented. My daughter-in-law left on the 58th day, and I was not there to watch it happen because my son asked me to stay at the apartment that morning, and I respected that. What I was there for was the following Saturday. I drove over at 9 in the morning. My son met me at the front door, the actual front door, not the backyard gate. He was wearing the old University of Georgia hoodie he'd had since sophomore year, which I hadn't seen him in since I arrived. He had a cup of coffee in each hand. He gave me one and stepped back to let me inside. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been since I arrived. Those burgundy curtains were gone. He'd taken them down the previous morning, he told me. First thing, the light came through the bare windows and landed on the floors the way it used to, in long panels that shifted through the afternoon. We spent that day putting things right. Not all of them. Some things would take time, and some things were simply gone. But there were boxes in the basement, things my son had stored down there when the rest of the house became inaccessible to him, in the way that things become inaccessible when they belong to your life, but not to the life you're being required to live. His mother's wooden recipe box, a framed photo from our fishing trip in 2009, the 2 of us squinting into the sun, holding up a bass that was, I will maintain to this day, larger than it appeared in the photograph. 3 of his mother's watercolors that he'd quietly moved to the basement before they could be taken down by someone who didn't know what they were. We hung the watercolors back on the living room wall in the afternoon. The fish photo went on the mantel. He found a nail for it himself, measured twice, drove it in with 3 even strokes of the hammer. He stood back and looked at it. I stood next to him. "Better," I said. "Yeah," he said. I want to say something to anyone who has been where my son was, who is there right now, or who has watched someone they love get smaller and smaller inside a life that was supposed to be theirs. Isolation happens quietly. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It works by making you feel like the problem, by shrinking your world until the cage becomes invisible because there is nothing outside it to compare it to. If you have noticed that someone you love has stopped reaching out, that their calls have gotten shorter, that they seem carefully managed in ways they weren't before push, ask the uncomfortable questions. Show up unannounced if you have to. I spent 8 years respecting a boundary that turned out to be a wall that someone else had built. I am not spending 8 more that way. My son is doing well. He went back to work the week after the court date. His clients, many of whom had known him for years, were glad to see him. He's been eating properly and sleeping in the actual master bedroom, in a room that he repainted himself on a Saturday in November, a warm gray that his mother would have had opinions about and that he chose entirely on his own. We have dinner together twice a week. Sometimes I cook, sometimes he does. He makes a pot roast that is honestly better than mine, which I have told him, and he finds this funnier than is strictly necessary. I am not going back to Canada. My contract ended in December, and I declined to renew it. Greg understood, and we had a beer over video call, and he told me to look after myself, which is what he says when he means something else. I found a position with a local HVAC company, different field from pipelines, but work is work, and at my age, you value proximity over prestige. The commute is 14 minutes. I can be at my son's house in 8. 8 years ago, I left because I told myself distance was the responsible thing, the practical choice, the financial choice. I built a life out of being useful from far away, and I mistook the money I sent for presents, which is a mistake I think a lot of fathers make and that I would not wish on anyone. Proximity, it turns out, is not a luxury. It is a form of protection. And it is a form of love. The house on Clover Ridge Drive is 40 years old this year. The foundation I poured myself. The framing my father helped me with, the summer before he died, when he drove up from Valdosta and worked alongside me for 3 weeks without complaint and told me exactly twice that I was doing something wrong and was right both times. My wife picked every color. My son grew up in it. And now it is my son's again, fully and completely, with his name on the deed and light coming through the windows every morning the way it was always supposed to. Some things take longer to get back than they should, but they can be gotten back. I need you to know that. If you've been away from the people you love, whether by distance, by silence, by the particular kind of pride that tells you everyone is fine, that no news is good news, that they would call if they needed you, I am telling you from experience, go check. Don't wait for a good time. Don't tell yourself you'll visit when things settle down. Things do not settle down on their own. Sometimes they require a person who loves you to show up at the front door with a carry-on bag and 8 years of accumulated regret and enough stubbornness to stand in a conference room in front of a judge and say clearly, without hesitation, "This is my son. This is his house. And we are not leaving without what belongs to him." Go check on your people before it's later than you planned.